Hi, this is Paul. I mentioned on the statistics and narrative video that I had been making my way through this video, which is on the paper put out a few years ago by Peter Thiel on the Straussian moment. Now, I made it through the video and through the paper, and I certainly have thoughts about it, but my thoughts are going to be probably more focused on some of the things that many of the people aren't looking at, partly because I'm very interested in this question of the religious valence of secularity and what brought it about in terms of Jesus smuggling. And this has sort of led to all of the hubbub. And now I see on Twitter there's a new film by Meathead, Rob Reiner, of all people, on Christian nationalism. And Phil Vischer and Skye Jitani apparently are in it. I don't know if they are prominent upon it, but there's a reason we're talking about these issues now. And I think, sort of similar to what James Lindsay said, I think a lot of people are walking into this, a lot of Christians are walking into this kind of not walking into this without a lot of thought on both sides. And it has to do with secularity. And in terms of how this plays, it plays in very interesting ways in terms of the history of what different groups were doing. So nicely, I can just start with Millerman's video, and you can find the video. It'll be linked below. I'm not going to play the whole thing, obviously. Well, not obviously. I do play long videos sometimes. But there's a few portions of this I'm going to want to get to. So let's jump in.
First century started with a bang on September 11th, 2001. In those shocking hours, the entire political and military framework of the 19th and 20th centuries, and indeed of the modern age, with its emphasis on deterrent armies, rational nation states, public debates, and international diplomacy, was called into question. Okay, so the essay starts with the attacks of September 11th. Why? Because they inaugurated the 21st century with some crucial changes.
Now, again, it isn't just sort of arbitrary in terms of the changing of the calendar. 9/11 in many ways marked the end of the Cold War, came with the fall of the Berlin Wall in many respects. And then you had this period in between of, sort of the end of history. Well, people imagine that, things are going to be great here on in. And actually, there's some talk about what the end of history might mean later in this video. I don't know if we'll get to this video, but it is in the video that Millerman is doing. And there's some really interesting things in there. But, because it sort of, in a sense, if modernity began to die, or the Enlightenment began to die in the trenches of the First World War, it really becomes aware in the attack of 9/11.
To the political and military framework of the 19th and 20th centuries, and indeed of the modern age. So we're going to see that it is one of Thiel's aims in this essay to consider the very foundations of the modern world. And whether he thinks the attacks of 9/11 were the catalyst, ultimately that forces us to rethink that, or whether he thinks that they are somehow just part and parcel of the process that is leading to the undermining of the modern world, we can leave open. But calling the modern world into question is the very first sentence of this essay. How could mere talking or even great force deter a handful of crazy, determined, and suicidal persons who seemingly operated outside all of the norms of the liberal West? Okay, on one hand, the liberal West with its norms. On the other hand, the terrorists. And the question, how could mere talking or even great force deter the terrorists from operating outside the norms of the liberal world and attacking those norms? And what needed now to be done, given that technology had advanced to a point where a tiny number of people could inflict unprecedented levels of damage and death? Okay,
now,
so
it's important that this tiny number of people aren't a nation state. In other words, this group of that were identified primarily as religious could mobilize and do something like this to such great effect?
So a lot of questions packed into this opening paragraph. The awareness of the West's vulnerability called for a new compromise. And this new compromise inexorably demanded more security at the expense of less freedom. A compromise that you're all aware of now. On the narrow level of public policy, there needed to be more X-ray machines at airports, more security guards on airplanes, more identification cards and invasions of privacy, and fewer rights for some of the accused. Overnight, the fundamentalist civil rights mania of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, which spoke in the language of inviolable individual rights, was rendered an unviable anachronism. September 11th, you see, inaugurated a world in which we traded our liberty for security. Even as the debate over freedom and security gathered strength, whatever military force could be mustered was used to track down those responsible for the violence of September 11th. Despite rapid mobilization, those efforts met with limited success. America's antiquated military was not suited to fight such an enemy, for the enemy needed to be pursued not only in America or in a handful of terrorist camps in Afghanistan, but to the very ends of the earth. Even worse, like the Hydra, the enemy proliferated, so that for every slain jihadist, 10 more arose to seek martyrdom in perverse emulation. On the broader level of international cooperation and development, September 11th called for wholly different arrangements. The issue of unilateralism and of the institutions designed to provide a cover for unilateralism could be raised publicly by serious people for the first time since 1945. Much has been said elsewhere about the relative roles of the United States and the United Nations in the political sphere, but the underlying debates extend to even more fundamental issues, and Thiel is now going to address those issues here. For present purposes, he writes, it is worth drawing attention to one such fundamental issue, the 20th century policy debate about the containment of violence. Following World War II, the centrist consensus on international development called for enormous wealth transfers from the developed to the developing world. Under the aegis of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and an array of other organizations, hundreds of billions of dollars were funneled in cheap loans or outright grants to third world governments, thereby, as the theory went, fostering economic growth and prosperity. Right? Give them money, elevate them to the first world, or at least pay them off enough for them to stop posing a significant challenge of any kind, and there you go, you'll contain violence. But was this consensus right? Are economic incentives in fact powerful enough to contain violence? It looked beforehand like wealth transfers made a certain amount of sense in the late 1940s. Those who had taken Marx seriously and were haunted by the specter of communist revolution hoped the wealth transfer apparatus would help win the Cold War and bring about world peace. For the Rockefellers to keep their fortunes and their heads, it was perhaps prudent for them to give some of what they had to the wretched of the earth and make them a little bit less wretched. And in case you're offended by the language there of the wretched of the earth and you think that this is Thiel being some sort of horrible person, no, he's referring here to a book by Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and he's not himself slandering or insulting those who received economic development funds. Okay, but after the fact, one wonders how policymakers could have been so naive. Let us set aside the inconvenient fact that the wealth transfer apparatus never worked as advertised, so that the West's wealth was largely squandered on white elephant projects. No real economic development took place, and even in the best of cases, the money supply circulated simply back to the West, ending up in Swiss bank accounts held by third world dictators. Okay, so let's set aside that inconvenient fact. As recent events have illustrated vividly, the real problem with the theory goes much deeper. For when the long-expected blow finally came, it did not come from the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, or from starving peasants in Burkina Faso, or from Tibetan yak herders earning less than $1 a day. On the contrary, it came from a direction none of the modern theories had predicted. The perpetrators were upper-middle-class Saudi Arabians, often with college degrees and with great expectations. Their mastermind, Osama bin Laden, had inherited a fortune now worth an estimated $250 million, mostly made during the Saudi oil boom of the 1970s. Had he been born in America, bin Laden could have been a Rockefeller. Okay, so that shows you that the economic question couldn't be the decisive one, because here you had somebody with quite great wealth who nevertheless attacked the liberal world, its norms and institutions.
Okay, and that's a huge point. Now, someone recently sent me this video by Kidology, which is digging into the fact that a whole bunch of, now we're getting into the question of Islam. I've been very patient to get into this because this is going to require a lot of nuance and sensitivity, and especially because in a lot of ways religions aren't quite what we think they are, because our imaginations, if you look at the James Lindsay video, again, you had the three things. You sort of had religions give meaning, religions kind of track identity, and then religions are a control access. So those are three of the ways that religions function.
But do bear with me.
This morning I read Letter to America, which is Osama bin Laden's letter to America explaining why he attacked Americans. And I am ashamed to say that I not only have never read this letter, but I didn't even know this letter existed. It's wild, and everyone should read it. If you haven't read it yet, read it. However, be forewarned that this has left me very disillusioned, and I feel the same exact way I felt when I was deconstructing Christianity. I feel a little bit just confused, like I have entered into another timeline. What is this? And yeah, so go read it.
I find it fascinating that people are discovering Osama bin Laden's letter to America. And not just this letter to America that was on The Guardian and has since been taken down, but also his collected works and interviews that have been transcribed, in which he basically says the same key points and phrases, makes the same excuses and explanations for why he is doing what he is doing, why he and Al-Qaeda are against the West, and specifically the United States. And by the United States or America, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda then, as now, the small factions that are still left, mean not just American soldiers, but specifically and even more importantly, American civilians. That is American men, women, and of course, children. Now, I'll get back to this because this is a key emergence and a key conceptual lack of distinction between combatants and civilians that is itself a very new, or at least in terms of since modern history, new idea that really took hold after the end of the Cold War. And it especially took hold in what we now know and we now call fundamentalist organizations, specifically Islamic fundamentalist organizations. Now again,
we're going to have to deal with this word and concept fundamentalism
sort of reaction video, whatever this is, I am going to be focusing heavily on Islamic fundamentalism, not in the way of sort of looking at the history of Islamic fundamentalism or quoting scripture from the Quran, but instead crucially looking at its theoretical underpinnings, looking at how it has been interpreted and made sense of by especially experts in international relations and experts in counterterrorism and in terrorist groups. A book that is actually really good on this was written by the former Vice Chancellor of Oxford University.
So to start with, what do we talk about, what do we mean when we use this term that's very broadly used, terrorism? Very simply, I think terrorism is the deliberate targeting of non-combatants for political purposes. So it is the means that a group use, not the ends that they seek, which should determine whether or not a group is a terrorist group. In the book, I actually go through a more elaborate definition listing 7 crucial characteristics that I'd be happy to get into. But the key is that it's the means used, not the ends that are being sought. And I would argue that unless and until we're willing to label a group whose goals we consider legitimate a terrorist group, if they deliberately target civilians to achieve those goals, then we're never actually going to make progress in countering terrorism.
And I would argue that...
Okay, now targeting civilians instead of, well, targeting soldiers, Well, how are civilians and soldiers different? Soldiers are, in a sense, an embodiment of a principality. They're an embodiment of a hyper object. They're an embodiment of the United States of America. They wear uniforms, and therefore they are supposedly fair game in terms of this game of international struggling. They are what principalities and powers are supposed to fight with and address each other, not civilians. Civilians are supposed to be private individuals. Now, this is going to have a lot of ramifications downstream. Now, of course, part of what happens in the 20th century is that after the Second World War, there's a considerable conversation with respect to nationalisms. And that leads off this whole assumption about, well, how can we stop nations from doing to each other what they have done? In other words, the Second World War, nations fighting over territory, nations fighting over resources. So, well, let's make sure that these nations have enough resources. So we'll redistribute money so that if they have enough resources, then everything should be fine. But of course, what happens with the attacks by Osama bin Laden, he is a multimillionaire. He has plenty of resources, and the people that he is recruiting also are not the wretched of the earth. They are not the poor people in a slum. They are, in fact, and this is sort of opposite of, let's say, what was introduced by the French Revolution. The French Revolution gets kicked off partly because people don't have anything to eat. And that sort of sets up the apocryphal story of let them eat cake, etc., etc. So quite naturally, the answer was, let's redistribute wealth. Well, you hear that today plenty. In other words, this narrative continues to go on. Let's redistribute wealth, and once wealth is redistributed, then you hear this in the Israeli-Gaza thing. Gazans are poor, Israelis are rich. Therefore, if we redistribute wealth, then the Gazans will settle down. It's really a stretch to believe that, because what we've seen is that Osama bin Laden had plenty of money and used that money to attack. If you had given Hamas and Gaza more money, they just would have had better weapons to attack with. The fundamental aspect is not how much money, and this leads then into the question of human nature. Now, we have heard this again and again and again in this little corner, that the question of human nature, especially in the context of all this transhumanism, this is the question we should keep focusing on.
Another example of bin Laden be the decisive one, because here you had somebody with quite great wealth who nevertheless attacked the liberal world, its norms and institutions. In this way, the singular example of bin Laden and his followers has rendered incomplete the economically motivated political thought that has dominated the modern West. From the wealth of nations on the right to Das Kapital on the left, okay, so from Adam Smith to Marx, and to Hegel and Kant and their many followers somewhere in between, the brute facts of September 11th demand a re-examination of the foundations of modern politics. The openly intellectual agenda of this essay is to suggest what that re-examination entails. So let's see again. We have Peter Thiel. We've got his essay, The Straussian Moment. We start with 2001, 9/11.
Now again, Peter Thiel is a billionaire. So, but yet, we listen to him to a degree because he is a billionaire. And people up in the hierarchy, we pay attention to those up above us because we hope that one way or another, perhaps, they will be of use to us. In other words, we instrumentalize those above us in the hierarchy, hopefully for our own elevation.
11, the attacks. And you have the attacks forcing us to rethink the foundations of the modern world, in particular, to rethink the consensus that you can contain violence with economic transfers and economic incentives. The problem is on the left and on the right, the dominance of economic interpretation of politics, or the economically motivated political thought that has dominated the modern West, whether we're talking about Adam Smith or we're talking about Kant, and even in between all of these other, Marx or Adam Smith or Kant or Hegel, we are now forced to reconsider the foundations of modern politics. That's a big task. And Thiel declares that this openly intellectual agenda is to suggest what that re-examination of the foundations of modern politics entails.
Now, I am not going to go through the whole paper. And I do have thoughts about whether or not, we'll see if I get to it here, whether or not this Straussian moment, if that is, in fact, the right conceptualization. What I'm much more interested in is the foundations of secularity a long time before and how that sets up. And I think Thiel is right in that the West, Christendom that colonized the world through secularity, effectively said, let's take religious questions off the table. Now, that doesn't mean that those questions are necessarily answered, which he's going to get into. But there is within it, obviously, assumptions, working assumptions about human nature.
So a nice project set out here. And whenever you're thinking about the foundations of politics, in this case, the foundations of modern politics, it is perfectly sensible to turn to the question of human nature. Because as you can see, if you think that the causes of violence are primarily economic and that the way to contain violence is primarily economic, then you have implicitly there a certain theory of human nature, why people act, what they want, what makes them violent, and what could make them peaceful. But if you're going to re-examine the foundations of modern politics...
Now, it's helpful to also remember that we're dealing with people as sort of conceptualizing them as individuals, not as... There is a collective aspect to that, but not as, let's say, distributed bodies.
You need to reopen the question of human nature, and therefore Thiel does just that in this next section of his essay. From the Enlightenment on, he writes, modern political philosophy has been characterized by the abandonment of a set of questions that an earlier age had deemed central. Okay? From the Enlightenment on, modern political philosophy, characterized by the abandonment of a set of questions that an earlier age had deemed not just somewhat interesting, not just kind of important, but central. What is a well-lived life? What does it mean to be human? What is the nature of the city and humanity? How does culture and religion fit into all this? For the modern world, the death of God was followed by the disappearance of the question of human nature.
Okay, now these are all religious questions.
Okay, this is a very important paragraph just setting out the general idea that a crucial set of questions were dropped in modernity from the Enlightenment on. And this disappearance, as he continues, had many repercussions. If humans can be approximated as rational economic actors, and ultimately even Adam Smith and Karl Marx agree on this point, okay, so the economic theorist of the right, the economic theorist of the left, then those who seek glory in the name of God or country appear odd. But if such odd people are commonplace and capable of asserting themselves with explosive force, then the account of politics that pretends they do not exist needs to be re-examined.
Okay, let's get into this question of fundamentalism. One of the definitions of fundamentalism is, do I speak English? Do fundamentalists basically reject this move? What's interesting about someone like Phil Vischer and Skye Jitani participating in the Rob Reiner film is that evangelicals tended to be fundamentalists light. Fundamentalists tended to be the hardcore, those who rejected this move. And even in the Christian Reformed Church, I suppose, qualified in some ways as fundamentalists in that we continued to resist the reduction of human nature down into the economic aspect. That people weren't fundamentally economic, and this is what, again, Jordan Peterson keeps mentioning Dostoevsky with respect to this. economics is a part of our human condition, but as many have noted for a long time, once economic need is satiated, additional economics no longer, there are diminishing returns for additional monies, and now suddenly other aspects of our humanity take the fore. And given, again, a long history of asceticism, of a variety of things, the argument that human beings are fundamentally economic creatures seems weak, and fundamentalists have always resisted that.
Okay, we could say roughly parallel to what Thiel is arguing here about 9/11, you could say something similar about Trump when he was elected, right? You can't have a political theory or a model of the world that makes the election of Donald Trump impossible. You can't have that, obviously. You have.
This is such a crucial point that he makes. Again, this isn't in Thiel's paper. This is his point, that if Donald Trump winning an election is not accounted for within your theory, it's time to throw out your theory. And part of what happened in 2016, which was so remarkable, was it was unthinkable. Well, it just shows that the theory of the governing forces was bankrupt.
To take account of his supporters. You need a model rich enough to make sense of the fact that people wanted him as their president, enough people to vote him in at least once. And so,
and for me, that sort of sets Sam Harris on the wrong side of history, because his Trump derangement syndrome was so complete that, well, this is just not rational. Oh. So tell me about your assumptions.
So here too, if you have a model that has no room for love of country, no room for love of God, no room for zealous, religious, theocratic violence, and you try to reduce everything to lowest common economic denominator and it doesn't work, then you have a problem with your model. There is, though, of course, in contrast, I add here to the modern tradition, there is an older Western tradition. Thiel continues, a tradition that offered a less dogmatically economic view of human nature. That older account realized that not all people are so modest and lacking in ambition that they will content themselves, like Voltaire's Candide, with cultivating their gardens. Instead, it recognized that humans are potentially evil, or at least dangerous beings. And while there are vast differences between the Christian virtues of Augustine and the pagan virtues of Machiavelli, neither thinker would have dared lose sight of the problematic nature of humanity.
Now, Thiel focuses on the evil, but there's also, of course, the other side, which is the good. But that sort of gets shuffled off stage as well, to a degree, partly because of the dominance of Protestantism, where the monasteries are laid to rest and the family now becomes the small church.
Direct method for comprehending a world in which not all human beings are homo economicus would therefore appear to involve a return to some version of the older tradition. So the modern tradition is dominated by its economic outlook. The pre-modern or non-modern or classical or ancient tradition wasn't. So therefore we could in principle just return to the ancient tradition and try to understand our world that way. But Thiel asks, however, before we try to embark on that return, there's another mystery we must confront. Why did the older tradition fail in the first place? After all, it seemed to ask some obvious and important questions. How could these questions simply be abandoned and forgotten? Right? Like, it seems like if the old tradition was so much better, why was it replaced by something worse? It must have failed in some decisive respect, or what?
And this is something that conservatives, everybody has things they don't like to own up to. And this is something that conservatives often have to own up to, in that there are reasons for innovation and abandonment of old things for new things. And if you're not going to account for those reasons, you're probably not really dealing with a model either. Same as people who couldn't envision Trump. Well, you can't envision anything that's happening in the world today.
What? On the theoretical level, Thiel continues, the older tradition consisted of two radically incompatible streams, symbolized by Athens and Jerusalem. An enormous gulf separates Athens from Jerusalem. Pierre Manent summarizes this division in The City of Man. Quote, in the eyes of the citizen, what value is there to the mortification of the Christian, when what matters is not to fall on one's knees, but to mount one's horse? And the sins one ought to expiate, or rather correct, are not the sins one commits against chastity and truth, but military and political errors. In the eyes of the Christian, what value is there to the political and military endeavors of the citizen when he believes that victory or defeat, whatever the regime, this world is a vale of tears ravaged by sin, and that states are nothing more and better than vast bands of robbers? To each of the two protagonists, the sacrifices the other calls for are vain.
Now, that's a powerful quote. And I think when it comes to the question of leaving Christianity and abandoning it, that's a big piece of it. Now, my conversation with Peter Boghossian, I thought, went very well. But when YouTube showed me what he did with a short, now I haven't done anything with shorts on my channel, I was a little shocked. I was shocked because he took basically my argument about the cross, which was contextualized for him.
All of this Christian ethic about turning the other cheek and loving your neighbor and doing so sacrificially, we all depend on it because we depend on our mother sacrificing for us. We depend on our father sacrificing for the family. We want neighbors who will forgive us, even if it's probably not in their best interest. But in the long run, there's this great scene in Steve Martin's Leap of Faith where he's talking to this crucifix and he says to the Jesus on the cross, he says, you say the meek shall inherit the earth, and I say all they get is the short end of the stick. And he's right. But I also believe that what is given in that sacrificial way will be rewarded, and I think that's what the crucifixion says. All of this Christian ethic about turning the other cheek and loving your neighbor and doing so sacrificially, we all depend on it.
So I was delighted that he made that a short, but it took me by surprise.
Okay, competing commitments here. On one hand, the religious commitments of the believer and the church, and on the other hand, the, as it were, secular commitments of the citizen and his country, his city, and those are incompatible, or as Thiel put it, radically incompatible. For a long time in the Middle Ages and thereafter, the West tried to gloss over these conflicts and instead to build on the many things these traditions had in common. But in the long term, like two giant millstones grinding against one another, city and church wore each other down as they went from conflicts to conciliations. Each one's efforts to return to its original truth had strangely wrought its own defeat. Neither side ever could win decisively, but in the long term, each side could decisively discredit the other, thus giving rise to the modern quote-unquote individual who defines himself or herself by rejecting all forms of sacrifice. Since the city and the church reproach one another with the vanity of their sacrifice, the individual is the man who rejects each form of sacrifice and defines himself by this refusal.
Now, it's interesting how the city and the church are sort of set against each other. You know, the polis, is that what they're thinking about in terms of Athens versus Jerusalem as church? There's a lot there that I can't unpack right now.
So you had the city, you had the church, you had Athens, you had Jerusalem, and rejecting each of them and the sacrifices that they require, you have instead the individual. In practice, this dialectic was never simply or even primarily intellectual. For when one takes these questions seriously, they have serious repercussions. And the same holds for the modern and inverse moment that involved their abandonment. The early modern era of the West, the 16th and 17th centuries, was characterized by the disintegration of these two older traditions and by ever more desperate attempts to force everything back together into some functioning whole. Where agreement over questions of virtue, the good life, and the true religion was unraveling, the immediate attempt involved forging such an agreement through force. This force escalated in the periods of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation and culminated in the paroxysm of the 30 Years' War, which remains perhaps the most deadly period in the history of Europe. By some estimates, in Germany, the locus of the conflict, well over half the population was eradicated.
Okay. Now, one of the things, I mean, you will hear me on this channel not necessarily producing hagiography about the Protestant Reformation. There's a lot of people who like to talk as if that whole thing could have been avoided. Well, in France, where it was avoided, they had the French Revolution. I don't think any of this could be avoided. I don't think the Enlightenment could be avoided. And it should have been avoided. I think the Enlightenment brought us a lot of good things, even though it brought some new problems in. And so, you know, those who just want to, the Protestant Reformation. Well, unless you're going to somehow go back and, try and stop it by, somehow preventing Martin Luther from putting his 95 Theses or the Diet of Worms or whatever you want to do. It's not happening. And there's no going back and simply pretending like we can just go back to models of late antiquity or Byzantium or Constantinople will undo this. I'm skeptical.
However, at the end of this process, agreement had become more elusive than ever. The differences greater than ever. The violence had failed to create a new unity. This failure was formalized in the Peace of Westphalia, so that 1648 can be fixed as the single year that dates the birth of the modern era. Questions of virtue and the true religion henceforth would be decided by each sovereign. The sovereigns would agree to disagree. Inexorably, questions of virtue and religion became private questions. Polite and respectable individuals learned not to talk about them much because they could lead to nothing but unproductive conflict. So quick pause here. How did we get then from the old teaching to the new teaching? The old teaching was characterized by this radical tension, this somehow irresolvable conflict. The attempt to resolve the conflict was very violent and still failed. And so the substance over which there was a conflict was relegated to the private realm, to the private domain. And publicly, the word of the sovereign was the way things are.
Okay, agree to disagree. In other words, all of these deep questions. Now, this is within Christendom, okay? This is within, these are two groups of people that still see Jesus as Lord, but have differences about it with respect to a number of things. So in other words, this is a Christian civil war. And so that they share a whole bunch of different assumptions. So within that frame, they then decide to agree to disagree. And that's in a sense where secularity is, by virtue of its birth, Christian.
Just on to what you said in the wake of the Salman Rushdie thing, because while I think you're right that a lot of people fear being smeared or called, Islamophobic or racist or whatever for talking about some of these issues, I also think it's very clear now that there's good reason to be fearful, in Europe at least, if you speak up about some of these issues, or if you criticize the faith as you do, that you're likely to find yourself in danger. And the point that you made in your brilliant article was that we in the West have become confused about the source of that violence and where it comes from. Because we think, well, these people are so offended by something that's been said that they are outraged and that's why they're reacting this way. But it's not true.
Yeah. We tend to look at things from this, psychological perspective. We're hurting people's self-esteem, we're offending them, we're evoking emotions in them that are unpleasant, and thus they are reacting to our provocation. And I find that it is completely missing the point when it comes to what's going on with at least the more radical fringes of Islam, certainly, and I think, in fact, much of the problems that we're seeing. But in the radical fringes, they don't feel offended. And even if they do, that's not what's motivating them. That's not why they're moving forward. That's not why they're going to stab you tomorrow, because they're so offended and they just can't control themselves. And they're, that's even a racist idea on some level, that you are so incapable of controlling your emotions that you can't help but, have it just burst out of you in a fit of violence and rage. It's a condescension as well as just a point-blank misunderstanding.
So what is the
what's
truth?
going on.
What is it that motivates them?
What's motivating them is that they understand their faith as calling on them to defend it when it is attacked. So when somebody is taking part in an action that is prohibited by Islam, extremely prohibited by Islam in the case of drawing Muhammad, then they must, as dutiful Muslims, they must act and defend this faith, act in the way that God would want them to act. So it's less of a personal thing and more of this cosmic thing of defending this idea.
So it's essentially enforcing a blasphemy law on the West.
On everyone.
On everyone.
On everyone. It is a de facto blasphemy law that the entire world is, in one form or another, going through. And unfortunately, I mean, this is one of the trickier elements of it that you have to be able to just articulate, even though it's so difficult to articulate, that the higher the percentage of Muslims in your locality, the more that this blasphemy prohibition becomes actual de facto law, becomes something that you have to fear when you start talking about this religion. And so I think in America, I have less to fear than I do in many other parts of the world. I think I have less to fear here than I do in some parts of Europe, many parts of Europe, unfortunately. And this is also I even feel bad saying it because you're not supposed to talk about these things. But realistically, of course, if there's more people around you to hear what you're saying, to then interpret their belief in this very literal way, you're more likely to be in danger.
And what?
So you can see, again, they're living in two worlds. And that's behind a lot of that. There's deep agreements that have come into the world in certain places in the world that people are operating by, and in other people are not.
Okay, so you see, polite and respectable individuals learn not to talk about virtue and all the rest of it too much because they could lead to nothing but unproductive conflicts. For the modern world, questions about the nature of humanity would be viewed on par with the struggle among the Lilliputians from Jonathan Swift about the correct way to cut open an egg. Hobbes, the first truly modern philosopher, boasted of how he deserted and ran away from fighting in a religious war. A cowardly life had become preferable to a heroic but meaningless death. It is sweet and fine to die for one's country had been an important part of the old tradition. Henceforth, it would be seen as nothing more than an old lie. Okay, so these old things that were once important, questions about the nature of humanity, courage, and fighting for your fatherland, all of these things were treated as nothing more than an old lie. And so the Enlightenment undertook a major strategic retreat. If the only way to stop people from killing one another about the right way to open an egg involved a world where nobody thought about it too much, then the intellectual cost of ceasing such thought seemed a small price to pay. The question of human nature was abandoned because it is too perilous a question to debate. That's the first crucial point that you must think about and consider. What is the relationship between the modern era, modern political thought and modern philosophy, the desire to overcome violence, and the abandonment of the question of human nature? Okay, that is a package deal. You have to think about that together. And what, therefore, is at stake when we're rethinking the foundations of the modern world? We're rethinking the nature of violence. We're rethinking the question of human nature. So John Locke, the American Compromise. Thiel now turns his attention to discuss some of these modern thinkers. You see, he's not going here into Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Aquinas. No, we're starting here with the modern American compromise on the question of human nature and the figure who's most important for that, John Locke. The new science of economics and the practice of capitalism filled the vacuum created by the abandonment of the older tradition. That new science found its most important proponent in John Locke and its greatest practical success in the United States, a nation whose conception owed so much to Locke that one exaggerates only slightly to describe him as its definitive founder. By the way, let me just underscore for you something he says in this opening paragraph to make sure you don't miss it. The question of human nature is replaced by economics and capitalism. Okay, so thinking about what makes man man is replaced with economics, capitalism, production, consumption, money. Okay, and the higher questions and the higher standards are abandoned. We must return to the 18th century to appreciate the tremendous change Locke wrought. Revolutionary America was haunted by the fear of religious war and the fanatical imposition of virtue on the entire state. The Declaration of Independence's evocation of the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness had a counterpoint in the older tradition in which the first two had not existed, okay, right to life and liberty, and the pursuit of happiness would have seemed inferior to, and certainly much more subjective than, the virtuous life. Okay, so don't think that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is this like eternally present standard in the history of mankind. No, it's something new, and it's deliberately modern and non-ancient, okay? For the reasons that he just said. There was no right to life, or there was no right to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness would have seemed something less than the virtuous life. When one fast forwards to the America...
Now that also takes the focus of what we understand life to be into sort of the personal subjective space. And that's important because that will, in many ways, when people say they're horrified by what is happening in Gaza, well, they think of the suffering. Okay, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Our focus is on either the sense of pleasure received by economic release from anxiety or flourishing, or economic privation or other sorts of privation.
The 1990s, the larger context of the founding had been forgotten. America had proved so successful in shaping the modern world that most Americans could no longer recognize the originality and strangeness of its founding conception. Locke's personal example is instructive of the subtle path toward the liberalism of the American Revolution. Locke's argument proceeds in an understated manner. He does not wish to inflame passions by taking sides in the contentious debates of the 16th and 17th centuries. But, since it would be offensive to suggest that the things that matter most to people are silly or irrelevant, he must avoid inflaming passions by openly denigrating all those who do take sides.
Now, inflaming passions is such an interesting take here because, of course, it's the same language in the far older system, and you find this on the lips of the Orthodox about we don't want to inflame the passions. Well, the passions are, let's say the 7 deadly sins. Well, Locke is talking about political violence.
Okay, so he's not going to take a side, but he also can't insult the people who take sides. In no place is there a greater need for sensitivity than on the question of religion. Religious passions had led to religious wars, but a passionate repudiation of religion, and of Christianity in particular, did not promise peace. Locke did not need the examples of the French or Russian revolutions to know this. Okay, so he has to avoid taking sides and also avoid looking like he's not taking sides. You can neither fully embrace Christianity nor fully reject it. He's got a delicate problem on his hands here. And so, Thiel continues, the philosopher takes a seemingly moderate path. In the reasonableness of Christianity, the philosopher sets out to denounce those justly decried atheists who have openly questioned the importance of the rules set for mortals by the deity. But, in the process of this denunciation, we learn many new things about those rules. Locke teaches us that the command for children to honor their parents does not apply if the parents have been unnaturally careless. Marriage remains an important compact, but the wife has, in many cases, a liberty to separate from the husband. And the first and strongest desire God planted in men is not love of God or others, but a healthy concern with one's self-preservation. Unfortunately.
Now, when we get to talking about how to conceptualize these religions, one of the things that I've been getting and messages from a number of you about, so when I just, why am I being so sensitive to get into this whole question of Islam? It's because many of you are saying, well, I have Islamic neighbors or Islamic family, or I'm Muslim myself, and we are peaceful, law-abiding, dutiful citizens of the United States or the UK or something like this. We serve in the military, we pay our taxes, we do all these things, and we're Muslim. And I have absolutely no question or disagreement with this or skepticism about it. I see around me, again, I live in one of the most diverse areas of the United States. I am surrounded by people from all over the world with a whole variety of religious commitments in their past, present, and future. And in many respects, this common good citizenship is a function of people find support, justification within their own religious traditions with respect to these things. And it is in many senses something that is taught to us by the fact that life is better. Do I want to somehow fight my neighbors over their religion? And, going back to the question of the best way to cook an egg. Am I going to fight with my neighbors over this? It seems that we can, and I think this was underlying a lot of the new atheism. We can do all of these things that, you don't require religion to be a good neighbor. What tends to be obscured is that, again, Locke is within a Christian context, and all of these assumptions that were practiced and behaved were simply from that era. And something like, participating in the stoning of someone in the community who decided to identify as a Christian, or participating in the violence against a woman who somehow violated a particular all of this in, now again, democratic post-Reformation, all of this has so much culture and Christian culture built into it that when someone comes in now, and this is part of what people sometimes note, that people aren't banging on the door trying to leave the United States in order to immigrate to Iran or Saudi Arabia. Now, some are trying to get to Saudi Arabia, and sometimes it's just purely economic. It's not that the economic motivation is completely unfounded. There are many who are trying to get to the United States and Germany. They try and get into Europe. They try to get into the wealthier countries, but they also assume that they can take with them their religious commitments. These countries have freedom of religion, and they can practice them as long as they don't violate the law. Well, where do the laws come from? This is where we get into civilizational Christianity.
The state of nature is an ill condition, so that those living in it are needy and wretched. The escape from nature, however, provides the path to self-preservation and happiness. It follows from this that humans are not stewards of nature, for God has provided very little to start with, but are themselves the creators of wealth and property. Labor makes the far greatest part of the value of things we enjoy in this world. From there, the stretch to capitalist basics is modest. Avarice is no longer a mortal sin, and there's nothing wrong with the infinite accumulation of wealth. It follows quite naturally that the law of God and nature says that government must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people, given by themselves or their deputies. As for the person of Christ, Locke informs us that Jesus' words were not to be taken plainly. If Jesus had told people exactly what he was up to, the Jewish and Roman authorities would have taken away his life At least they would have hindered the work he was about, for his teachings would have threatened the civic order and functioning of government. And so Christ concealed his meaning so that he might live and teach. Locke's conception of Christ is a world.
Now, again, a lot of this is debatable, but you see Locke's point. And part of what has been so pervasive and successful in the developed West has been, so I can have a life with a degree of autonomy and freedom?
World removed from that of the medieval passion plays or the Passion of Mel Gibson. Still, the character Locke attributes to Christ comports rather well with the character that one reasonably might attribute to Locke himself and the passionless world he set out to create. Over time, the country founded by Locke would do away with Christian religiosity, even as it maintained many outward appearances of it. The United States eventually would become more secular and materialist, though most of its citizens would continue to call themselves Christians. There would be no catastrophic war against religion of the sort one had in France or Russia, but there would be no counter-revolution either. Only occasionally would conservative moralists express their perplexity at how a nation ostensibly founded on Christian principles could ever have drifted so far from its original conception. Never would it cross their minds to think that this process of gradual drift had been a part of that original conception.
Okay. Now, France and Russia are really helpful examples here because, well, England, Germany, Netherlands, the United States, deeply Protestant nations. France, Catholic. Russia, Orthodox. I've often wondered if by the Protestant Reformation was in a sense giving a compromise that would, trying to hold it at bay, led to the more catastrophic expressions of the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution.
Okay, so do you see? Locke, in effect, the founder of America, just about the founder, okay, almost the founder of so great importance is he to the American project and the American self-conception. He doesn't speak out against Christianity. In talking about the reasonableness of Christianity, though, he interprets it in a way that makes it perfectly compatible with his own understanding of liberalism and capitalism. So you can say Locke offers a sort of reform of the Christian teaching, or he lets his teaching wear the outward appearance of Christian doctrine. And built into Locke's political strategy is, as it were, the gradual weakening of what would be a fiery Christianity in favor of a fading away of the Christian element and a coming into prominence of the economic, capitalist, and liberal element. Okay, so that's what's described here. How do you delicately resolve the problem of diffusing what you see as a religious bomb without either, throwing it or having it blow up in your hands in just the way that Locke does here, according to Thiel?
Now it's interesting, again, that we've sort of been broadly talking about civilizational Christianity. But there is a distinction between these Protestant nations, England, Germany, Netherlands, United States, and of course the others that come after England, Australia, Canada, and France and Russia, and their own spheres of influence. I've made it through, again, the 8th episode of Hernan Cortez and the Fall of the Aztecs. Cortez goes from celebrating Mass on the beach to being the kind of man who destroys the Aztec civilization with the help of other indigenous people who also wanted to bring down the civilization. So there's a lot going on here.
In a capitalist world, violent debates about truth, whether they concern questions of religion and virtue or questions about the nature of humanity, interfere with the productive conduct of commerce. It is therefore best for such questions to be eliminated or obscured. You see again here the relationship between, on one hand, violence in the question of human nature, or of the most important things, of the first things, of the substantive things, and the need for a peaceful economic order. Okay, so it's best in the capitalist view for such questions to be eliminated or obscured. Thus, in Hobbes, all human complexity is reduced to the desire for power. Quoting Hobbes, the passions that most of all cause the difference of wit are principally the more or less desire of power, of riches, of knowledge, and of honor, all of which may be reduced to the first, that is, desire of power. For riches, knowledge, and honor are but several sorts of power. Okay, so everything reduces in Hobbes to power here. All human complexity reduced to the desire for it. In Locke's essay concerning human understanding, the author celebrates the conception of power while stripping it even further of anything that is specifically human. The will is the power to prefer one action over another. Liberty is the power to act on this preference. The understanding is a power. A substance is merely the power to produce certain empirical effects, but these effects tell us nothing of the nature of the underlying substance. Once again, Locke proceeds cautiously. He does not directly tell us that human nature does not exist, or that the older tradition of Aristotle and Aquinas is definitively wrong. He does not seek that clear a break with the past, but he undermines the older tradition relentlessly. For when we observe things, and these things include other people, we can see only their secondary effects as manifested by their various powers. We cannot know anything about their true natures or substances. It is an irreducible part of the human condition for humans to be limited, so that they can never know anything about the nature of humanity. To ask a question about human substance or the teleology of humanity's power leads to debates as meaningless as whether the best relish were to be found in apples, plums, or nuts. Okay, once again, what are we talking about? Okay, we're talking about the problem of human nature, the question of human nature, and how that question is deliberately delegitimized by Locke in his presentation so that it gets sort of defined away. It's not even something you can discuss, both because it interferes with our production and consumption, because it distracts us and gets us into violent debates and disputes, but also it's sort of defined away as a non-problem. You can't even answer it. You can't go there.
And this is why Mary Harrington, Paul Kingsnorth, people who are asking much more foundational questions about human nature, transhumanism. It's part of the reason that issue is coming up now, because transhumanism forces us to ask questions about it. The transgender debate forces us to ask questions about human nature. We were, for a few hundred years, able to sort of lay these things to a side. 9/11 forces us to ask questions about human nature.
It's like not the kind of question you can answer. It's meaningless. It leads to meaningless debates in Locke's presentation. In the place of human nature, continuing with Thiel's exposition, Locke leaves us with an unknowable X. This awareness of ignorance provides the lobe of solid ground on which the American founding takes place. Okay, what's the awareness of ignorance? Ignorance concerning human nature. We don't know what the human is. We can't know what the human is. Therefore, we have an unknowable X. Okay, this human X may have certain wants and preferences, but nobody is in an authoritative position from which to challenge those desires. And so, in a somewhat paradoxical manner, the unknowability of X, okay, the human X, leads to classic liberalism and the very strong assertion of the different rights that belong to that unknowable X. The freedom of religion, for we cannot ever know what people are truly thinking in the temple of their minds. The freedom of speech, for we cannot irrefutably criticize the way people express themselves. The right to property and commerce, for we cannot second guess what people will do with the things they possess. Capitalism, concludes Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, is simply what humans do when they're left alone. Let me just pause here to comment again. So you've taken the question of human nature off the table. You've replaced it with a question mark, or rather with an unquestionable X. X designates the unknowability of the human being. But erected on that unknowability of the human being are some very firm, solid, stable, liberal rights. So you have the stability of liberal rights erected on the unknowability of the human being. And this is a sort of modern configuration that Thiel is here walking us through. Of course, there are all sorts of hard boundary cases. One might wonder about what a libertarian framework has to say about the rights of children or criminals or insane people, or the limits of commodification, extortionate interest rates, indentured servitude, prostitution, sale of body parts, and so forth. But for Locke and the other American founders, these exceptional cases could be deferred for later consideration. In any event, the general principle of the unknowability of the human X would encourage a gradual expansion over time of the field of human freedom. Again, let's restate this from the opposite perspective. If you knew the human X, if it was a determinable substance, if it was a well-structured or well-ordered soul, if it was something precise and limited and delineated, then it probably would not be, or we could say would not be characterized by these bundles of rights and freedoms that depend on its being unknowable. So it's like, if you think the human being is a soul with reason, will, and desire, and that reason is the highest part of the soul, and that reason operates best when it contemplates eternal truths, and next is its practical function, and that the desires can be high or low, and the will can be corrupted or uncorrupted, then you have sort of a specific picture of man, and he's no longer primarily free to do whatever he wants, and somehow you've changed the whole topography of the human and the social and the political life, on the basis of a determinate and more or less delineable view of human nature. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, you've crossed that out, you've declared it unknowable, then you've erected rights as the protection of freedoms premised on this unknowability.
And now this was a successful thing. But again, it was bounded within a whole range of assumptions. And to the degree that this was successful and the assumptions were carried with it, those assumptions permeated other religions, they permeated other nations. Now nations, in many ways, by international law, look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, this went out over the world. And so a lot of Jesus smuggling went out through this WASP. Eleanor Roosevelt was in some ways Jesus smuggler par excellence.
There is one important, especially important category of boundary cases. Thiel continues, and that concerns the question of origins. We shall return to that broader question later, but here it's worth noting one specific variant. Even though we should not interfere with people disposing of their property as they see fit, how do we know that the property was acquired justly in the first place? The great importance of strong property rights would seem to force us to ask some hard questions about the origins of the property itself. Once again, however, Locke, this modern solution, urges us not to worry too much. There's very little value in the state of nature, the state before it's been admixed with human labor, and most value has been added by human work or intellect. As a result, we need not reflect on the past and can focus on the future.
Now, this whole concept between the state of nature and then what human beings do in terms of their economic activity, their science, their technology, in some ways you sort of see the beginning of this transhumanism right here already, that, nature is just a given, and what really matters is what we are able to construct. It's the city.
Most new wealth will be created by the strong enforcement of property rights going forward, and will be enjoyed by those who play by the capitalist rules. Those who acquired their property through violence will not be capable of growing their fortunes, and in time will possess only a small and uninfluential fraction of the world's wealth. Locke would dismiss out of hand Balzac's sweeping and subversive notion that behind every great fortune there lies a crime. We need not heed Brecht's call for more inspectors and inquisitors. Nothing should stop us from enjoying the prosperous tranquility of the capitalist paradise we have built for ourselves. So Thiel here is highlighting the fact that in Locke's system in which property rights play such a great role, Locke has to bracket or ignore, diminish, and hide, as it were, the question of whether and to what extent violence lies at the origin of acquisition of first property right ownership. Now, as you needless to say, no, there are leftist critics of liberal capitalism who make their criticism all about the fact that property is fundamentally violence, or that it's at first violence, and therefore you see a lot of this in the anti-colonial or decolonialist and decolonialism rhetoric, where they want to say, we are on the unceded territory of such and such peoples and so on. In other words, trying to reverse the process from the apparently legitimate property right claim to the actually illegitimate act of violence involved in that first appropriation. Okay, but at any rate for Locke, nothing should stop us from enjoying the prosperous tranquility of the capitalist paradise we've built for ourselves. Since September 11, our peace has been broken. For there remains another very important boundary whose existence the American people had forgotten. They had forgotten about the rest of the world and its deep division from the West. So the first boundary the West forgot was the boundary of violent acquisition and then, peaceful preservation. And the second was the boundary between the Western world and the non-Western world. They had forgotten about the rest of the world and its deep division from the West, Thiel continues. The non-Western world had not yet seen the Peace of Westphalia. The progress of the Enlightenment has occurred at different rates in different parts of the world. And in that world outside the West, questions of religion and the purpose of humanity remained central. Even in 2001, the greatest fear was not the fear of a painful death, like it might be for Hobbes and Locke, but fear of what would happen to one in the life after that death. Okay, so the non-Western world did not share the basic Enlightenment presuppositions and accordingly the Enlightenment anthropology of the modern West. And so a religious war has been brought to a land that no longer cares for religious wars. Even President Bush, who styles himself a religious conservative, cannot bring himself to believe that it is religion that really matters. Quoting Bush, "This great nation of many religions understands our war is not against Islam or against the faith practiced by Muslim people," unquote. Where Bush downplays the differences, bin Laden emphasizes them, contrasting the world of pure Islam and the world of the decadent West in the most extreme way imaginable. Quoting now bin Laden, "The love of this world is wrong. You should love the other world, die in the right cause, and go to the other world." Now I have to interject here briefly and say I think it was like 6 weeks ago, maybe even less, that there was a trend, apparently, viral trend on TikTok, of people rediscovering bin Laden, and apparently now sympathizing with his quote-unquote letter to America, or with his criticisms of American liberal capitalism. So somehow things, in that sense, in some circles are going all the way back to where they started. People now who are dissatisfied with Enlightenment, modern Western liberal capitalist political anthropology, finding common cause with even the Islamist criticisms of it. So,
what's going to be interesting, however, is they do that. Remember I talked about how sort of the Enlightenment was sort of ensconced within all of these Christian assumptions. Now these people who are eating every day, having freedom of choice, now they choose, well, I'm going to be Muslim now. Oh, but you're ensconced within Locke's world. And most of these people will do this without ever leaving Locke's world. Most of them are not going to move to Saudi Arabia, lose their driver's licenses, lose all of the things that they have come to enjoy here because they just enjoy them. This is something that they imagine they can add on top, and it won't. I made comment in the live stream today that one of the big differences I see in the 70s is that in the 60s and 70s, the counterculture, some in the counterculture, sort of actually in practice rejected the world and tried to live sort of outside of it. Now they live completely within it. They decry capitalism while they themselves wish to get rich on top of it and succeed in that system. Such performative contradictions won't lead to a consistent end. You just simply separate the elephant below from the chattering rider on top.
So that's an amazing thing to think about. Unfortunately, though, continuing here with the essay, bin Laden is not simply an irrelevant crackpot of the sort that one might find screaming at the bemused spectators in Hyde Park. For bin Laden, unlike Locke, Hard questions of morality and conduct need no postponement. Their answers are clear and resolution cannot be delayed. Bin Laden is a passionate man of wealth and power, so that his personal example reminds us of the boundary cases Locke so readily dismissed. Indeed, the oil industry, the source of bin Laden's wealth, presents one of the most glaring examples that run counter to Locke's felicitous generalizations. For most of the value of oil exists simply in nature, so that the quote-unquote labor that humans add by extracting and refining this oil is proportionally quite small, okay, versus Locke's theory that most of the value is added in the labor. At the same time, however, economies rise and fall on the price of crude oil so that it represents a significant share of the world's wealth. Indeed, the original expropriation of that oil built as many as half of the great fortunes of the 20th century. And so the development of the oil industry, presided over by autocrats and despots from Asia to the Middle East and Africa, is the not so hidden story of crime on a scale so grand that the proceeds of that crime suffice to purchase respectability and almost everything else. In helping to craft the post-World War II centrist economic policy consensus, the Rockefellers had forgotten their own family history. Of course, in the long run, it may well be that power and prosperity go to those who follow Locke's capitalist rules, so that in the long run, the religious fanatics who have so violently and suddenly interposed themselves will eventually lack the wealth and the technology needed to threaten the non-religious world the Enlightenment has built in the West. Okay, in other words, maybe in the long run, the powerful and the prosperous win. But none of this will matter if we're all dead in the short run. Okay, so today, mere self-preservation forces all of us to look at the world anew, to think strange new thoughts, and thereby to awaken from that very long and profitable period of intellectual slumber and amnesia that is so misleadingly called the Enlightenment. A beautiful paragraph, okay? A beautiful thought and a beautiful formulation. So mere self-preservation forces us, okay? So whatever else you may be interested in, presumably you're interested in self-preservation to a certain extent, especially if you're already a Lockean liberal capitalist type, for whom self-preservation is of a special importance. And if that's the case, well, self-preservation today forces us to look at the world in a new way, to think strange new thoughts. And what's going to be primarily strange about them and what's going to be primarily new about them? That they're going to go counter to the Enlightenment presuppositions, counter to the intellectual slumber and amnesia that we've inherited and that we have wrongly evaluated only positively. Okay, so we now need to think about what we might have missed and what else there might be for us to see. Okay, this is a good one sentence defense of the necessity of counter-Enlightenment thinking.
Now, later on, he's going to go into the Straussian moment, which is, to a degree, the facing of these two worlds and the argument that, well, you can't actually, so the West will engage these questions as a police action rather than as a civilizational combat. And what's interesting is, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, you have a sense of a civilizational culture war, but part of where actually the police action has tended to make more sense in that this has not become as it was in the late Middle Ages, all the way up into the weak man of Europe, which was the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Sort of a civilizational conflict where you have kingdoms or empires battling each other literally on battlefields. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, major Islamic nations have, one way or another, for the most part, imbibed most of the Lockean principle. Pakistan is much more concerned about its threat, its conflict with India. So you do sort of have two religious bodies, and then China, of course, which is playing a communist game, which is deeply Lockean. It's not really Lockean. It's Locke's other side, which is Marx. So you've got Iran, which is trying to maybe do this, but are they really? So what's happening now among people is they are trying to suss out and work through these questions for themselves from within a Lockean world. And so when I see these women, Local Distance had this on his Twitter feed. So you have these people that are reading the Quran and getting all excited about it. And whereas I'm sure there are a few of them that will stick with it, most of them, they went to an evangelical church for a while. They were into yoga for a while. They're doing this for a while. Maybe they'll get in with a group of people that will help them go deeper. And it'll be interesting because some of them will be attracted by one thing or another thing. But yeah, where's this going? Probably not real far. And certainly not out of sort of the Western world where, for many people, all of this is sort of a thin religious veneer that is sort of floating on top. And, they'll play with whatever religious thing. This is sort of Clay Rutledge's point about they will sort of believe in anything. And so they're playing with these ideas. And part of what's going to happen, I think, in the West, as I think in another video, go back over the rest is history's treatment of Muhammad. As Islam, to the degree that Islam becomes sort of a viable option here, it then will have to contend with all of the things that Christianity has been contending with for the last few hundred years, which as, well, let's look at this origin story. Well, let's look at the historical Muhammad. Well, let's look at exactly what is behind all of this stuff. And I think it's going to have some real trouble. Academics in the West have already been dealing with this, and I think they will. I think there's going to be issues. I sort of trollishly said, "Oh, monogamy as an oppressive patriarchal tyranny. Let's try polygamy." Of course, you can have up to 4 wives. So as we deal with these issues, now when it comes sort of full term around to, now when it comes down to this whole Christian nationalist thing, again, basically the Lockean project is meeting its end. Conversations now, because of globalization, because of coming to the end of this chapter in civilizational Christianity, these issues have to be addressed again. And it's ironic that you have some evangelicals like Phil Visser, who in many ways would be in some aspects fundamentalistic, because they continue to promote a conversionist Christianity, and Phil will continue to do that. But what about the broader environment? And this is the conversation that's going to go into, okay, was Locke enough? Was Locke really, and of course the New Atheists basically said, well, the Enlightenment was a break from Christianity instead of a continual development within and from and surrounded by Christianity. You can debate whether or not it was a heretical one or whether it should have gone that way. This is where the conversation is going. And it's just very interesting seeing how Locke sort of pivoted and don't pay any attention to the guy behind there. If we can just get the economic picture right, then, okay. But the economic picture couldn't fundamentally satisfy and resolve. So, all right, I wanted to bring that in, and yeah, we'll keep working on this. Let me know what you think. Leave a note in the comments.